You go, Doug.
So we're going to recommence. I'd now like to welcome our next witnesses. Could each witness please state their name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation?
Okay, Margaret Crawford, Auditor-General for New South Wales. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Scott Stanton, Acting Deputy Auditor-General. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Claudia Migotto, Assistant Auditor-General for Performance Audit. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Great, thank you for that. I'll just mention before I invite you to give an opening statement that we've got our colleagues David Shoebridge from the morning session, but we're also joined by our colleague the Honourable Migotto on the WebEx system there.
Lou.
So, I might know we're joined in person by the Honourable Matthew Mason Cox.
Pleasure to be here, Chair.
Very good.
Here with the phone's breaking up a bit.
Do your best. Ms Crawford, I might ask you to
Thank you.
have an opening statement if
Thank you, and I thank the committee for inviting us here to appear today. Look, just to assist the committee in its inquiries, I'll very briefly overview the relevant work undertaken by the Audit Office in assessing grants administration. I'll stick pretty closely to the submission we made. As noted in that submission, the Audit Office has conducted 5 performance audits over the last 7 years that have examined selected grants administration processes in detail. These performance audits have encompassed regional assistance programs, grants to non-government schools, government assistance to industry, regional road funding and the club grants scheme. Reference has also been made to this inquiry about a 2009 performance audit, which resulted in an update to guidance that's provided by the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and that guidance is still in place. Other performance audit topics have also touched on issues relating to grants administration whilst not being the primary focus. For example, my recent report on support for regional town water infrastructure found that a number of projects funded under the New South Wales Government's Safe and Secure Water Program, Round 2, had not been recommended through the advertised technical review panel process. I also, as you'd know, undertake financial audits, which include entities that manage grants programs. This work provides assurance about the accuracy of the entity's financial statements taken as a whole, but also including the accounting for grants administered. On occasions, matters identified through that process are followed up in more detail through a performance audit. The findings of the reports included in my submission to this inquiry have identified some consistent themes regarding the improvement opportunities available to agencies that administer grants. These reports have identified some consistent gaps in the monitoring of grants programs and whether they are achieving their intended outcomes. All 5 performance audits identified weaknesses in how the responsible agencies had monitored whether the funds were being allocated according to the grant program guidelines, whether they had set targets consistent with the program objectives, evaluated the outcomes or measured benefits against the grant program objectives. The reports also highlighted that grant program objectives and guidelines should be clear and consistently applied. This was particularly important for transparency and fairness in the application assessment process. These reports also demonstrated the importance of keeping accurate records and maintaining transparency about how and to whom grant funds have been allocated, as well as publicly reporting information about overall fund allocation and the achievement of program objectives. So the administration of grant programs continues to be a focus in my published audit program. Given the scale, particularly at the moment, of the government's response to recent emergencies, including COVID-19, I've actually just commenced an audit related to grants administration for disaster relief, which will examine the $750 million small business support fund set up to support businesses affected by bushfires and COVID-19. Also, for some other forthcoming audits, one that's currently close to finalisation involves the waste levy and grants made for waste infrastructure, and that's examining the effectiveness of New South Wales Government in minimising waste sent to landfill, including through waste infrastructure grants programs. We'll shortly commence a more general grants administration audit that will look at the governance, probity and benefits realisation for a number of grants programs across a number of agencies. And we've also flagged that we'll do an audit of investment in regional development, looking at whether regional development and grant programs are well coordinated and delivering the improvements that the program set out. So that's sort of an overview of what we've done and what we're proposing to do. So I will pause there and hopefully answer your questions.
For that, I'll hand to Ms Yusos.
Thanks very much, and thank you both for your time this afternoon and for your very useful submission to our inquiry. I've got a few questions across a broad range of topics, but I wanted to start with something that we heard from the ICAC Chief Commissioner this morning that you might not have been familiar with. I don't expect that you've been watching our proceedings closely.
I might have had a little look.
Okay. So one of the things that he suggested this morning was that it would actually make your job easier as the Auditor-General to review or to do your work if there are clear criteria that you can judge the grants programs against. Is that correct?
That would be correct, because as audits always assess or provide assurance of performance against criteria. So establishing clear criteria is always helpful.
And in undertaking your review, now I understand you do your financial audits and then also your performance audits, which are slightly different. In doing that, are you checking whether a grants program is conforming to broader government policies, or is it more about the way that the actual financial accounts are being sort of marked off?
Sort of both. So the financial audits will look at, we audit every state government agency every year. So what the financial audit is looking to do is really just account for the funding that's provided for grants and how that's expended. So I'll perhaps defer to Scott to add to this after I finish speaking. So that's what the financial audit does. It's not really looking to see whether every grant allocated went to the right agency or whatever. It's really the accounting for those funds. Now I've lost track of the first question. A performance audit will look in the first instance at the legislative framework and what the grants program is intended to achieve and how the relevant agency has set up the arrangements for that program, and we'll audit against that, as opposed to a set of generalised guidance. Having said that, obviously we would have regard to some of the key principles about probity and effective management of grants programs, which are more sort of general principles. Scott, Claudia? Scott?
I think you answered it very well. So certainly our focus from a financial audit point of view is very much on, did the grant transaction take place? Was it accurately recorded in the records and reflected in the financial statements? So that's, and like Margaret said, the Auditor-General said, our audit is focused on assurance that the financial statements as a whole is accurate, not necessarily an individual grant program. That's more in Claudia's area.
And in performance audits, we can and do have regard to government policy and how that's expressed in it may be through legislation or grant guidelines or broader policy objectives that the grant is intended to fulfil. That's quite a significant point of awareness that we would have in going into performance audits.
Can I just ask though, but just to clarify, it's not an evaluation against broader government best practice guidelines, and I draw the exact example of the ICAC submission and the information that the ICAC Commissioner provided around the DPC guidelines. Your audits, would they evaluate whether grants programs are in accordance with those?
We have broad regard to those guidelines, but they operate at quite a principles level. And so what we would usually take into consideration in assessing grants performance is relevant legislative frameworks, grants-specific guidelines, and the mechanisms that agencies have set up by way of an assessment process. And so that all should be ideally sort of stepped out, and we will assess the performance of a grants program against those sorts of issues.
So can I just bring you to the approvals part of a grants process, both the individual grants and the guidelines themselves. In terms of the approval process of the granting of grants, what's the expectation in your audits that you will that a minister will undertake in order to fulfil those obligations?
Look, at a very high level, our expectation is that the agency follow the published guidelines for eligibility, assessment criteria, the process that they've said would be followed, the purpose, intent of the grants program. So we're always looking to see whether what actually happened reflects what's communicated to be what's supposed to happen.
But I guess I'm getting specifically to the minister saying, yes, we're going to approve this grant. Is an email enough? Do you need a signature from a minister? What do you think is appropriate?
I might defer to Claudia for the detail, but I guess the fundamental is clear documentation as the reason, as to the reason for a decision, whether it's either supportive of the recommendation made to the minister or, in fact, whether it's contrary to that. But Claudia, did you want to add?
I guess the approval environment can be different depending on the structure of the grant, and I understand this committee has heard a bit about grants from the Restart New South Wales Fund, for example. Those have been subject to some of our performance audits, and that requires that INSW makes a recommendation to the Treasurer, who then provides that recommendation to ERC. So that's quite a structured approvals process that's established in law, but that sort of a process is not necessarily uniform across all grants processes. In terms of the standard of evidence that we require, as Margaret's said, certainly documentation and clear justification is a basic standard that we would be looking for.
So can I just raise something there? See, a program such as has been rolled out for bushfire relief is going to be far more flexible, is it not, in terms of both the criteria that's applied and, in a sense, the documentation that supports it. That's a much more, in a sense, much less robust in terms of both criteria and the paperwork administration, it seems to me. That would be right, wouldn't it?
We haven't audited that program yet. We're about to. But I guess what you're referencing there is the proportionate nature of the administrative arrangements relative to the intent of the program, the speed with which it needs to be delivered, etc. They are the matters that we would consider when we audit that program. So, we're unlikely to say, oh, well, you did it so quickly, you haven't put in place. We're looking for proportionate arrangements that clearly go to the intent of the program, and then having established that, how well did the agency actually carry out that intent?
Yep.
So just one final question. The main focus of our hearings today is the Stronger Communities Fund, and I understand you haven't undertaken a specific audit into that program, but some of the documents that were presented to the Parliament in a call for papers said, we saw an email that said, for audit purposes, I need an email approving that. Is that best practice?
It's really hard to generalise without an email is a state record, so hypothetically that can be a form of justification or explanation. It really depends on what's in the email.
You would be looking for, sorry, just to reiterate your earlier testimony though, a clear statement, a signature or some kind of indication that the minister had approved it, and the reasons for that though. That's really what you would consider best practice?
I think what I said earlier is that we're looking for clarity around the justification for the decision making, whether that occurs at a ministerial level or at departmental level might vary from case to case.
Right, I'll turn to Mr.
Can I just follow that up?
Well, so one question from Mr Khan, then we're heading to Mr Shoebridge.
Well, again, if we use the example of the bushfire relief, you wouldn't be expecting to see a ministerial signature on every grant that was approved for that style of program, would you? You can't establish a best practice and say every program is going to need to be signed off by a minister. That would be, with respect, ludicrous, wouldn't it?
The onus of developing the arrangements is really with the agency. Our role then is to provide assurance that the proper processes were then followed. So, is the answer to your question, no, we wouldn't expect that. If the agency has designed a program that requires that, then we would expect it. But if they've designed a program that doesn't require it, then we wouldn't. We'd be looking at what was the design of the program and have they followed consistently and transparently that process.
David Shoebridge.
Thank you, Auditor-General and everyone. So there's no difficulty with there being delegations and ministerial power being delegated down, provided there's clear guidelines and a procedure to allow that delegation to happen. Is that right?
In general terms, that's right. Yep.
Could I ask you just about some of the evidence we've got about the Stronger Communities Fund, the second round of that? It's being called the Tide grants round, which was some $252 million. Could I first ask about, in terms of if there's a pool of public money available for, say, a group of councils or a set group of entities that are established in the guidelines, is notification to the potential applicants, is that something you look at from an audit point of view, if there's been adequate notification to the pool of potential applicants?
It would generally be dependent on the structure of the grants process and whether the grants were delivered through an expression of interest process, which is not necessarily the case in every instance, and not in every instance that we've conducted performance audits of. So it's hard to be more specific than that, Mr. Shoebridge.
Well, I'll give you this and the scenario we have for the Stronger Communities Tide grants round. As I said, it's a pool of money that ended up being something like $252 million. The guidelines were amended in the middle of 2018 to open up so that it was about merged councils. The first round of the Stronger Communities funding had been to give money to councils that had been merged. And then in the middle of 2018, it was expanded to cover councils that had been the subject of, that had been merged or were the subject of a merger proposal. Are you at all familiar with those two tranches of grants funding?
Only at a general level through following this inquiry and, other reporting. We are yet to commence an audit that would actually look into that in more detail.
I understand. We had I found quite challenging evidence from the head of the Office of Local Government, who said in relation to that second pool of funding, the $252 million, which was available for councils that had been the subject of a merger proposal, he said that councils were only notified about being eligible for it. This is from a pool of some 33 councils that were the subject of merger proposals, that there was no notification to all 33 councils, that in fact notification only ever happened once a project in a council area had been approved, and it was only once a project in a council area had been approved that council was technically eligible, and therefore only once all the decisions had been made that they were notified about this pool of potential money for merged councils. Have you come across that kind of notification process where the notification follows the decision to give us, a set of money to one of a number of potentially available recipients?
Not to my knowledge in the time I've been Auditor-General, but I might defer to Claudia, who may have referenced previous audits.
None of our audits that we've mentioned in our submission highlight a notification process like that. But I think it's perhaps worth noting for the benefit of this committee that we have indicated that we may look at this program specifically as part of our performance audit program. As much as we would like to be helpful to this inquiry process, we do intend on, moving forward and looking at that program in more detail, and will ultimately be helpful to the Parliament in conducting a detailed performance audit of that. And we wouldn't want to necessarily prejudice that process by expressing an opinion on these things here today that we then are going to go forward and audit in a greater level of detail, potentially. But having said that, of course, with your permission, Auditor-General, we're happy to be as helpful as we can today.
Well, maybe we'll lift to putting this at a sort of more general proposition rather than delving down into this one particular project, or despite it being such a large grants round. What about the concept that you you have a set of guidelines which may apply to a group of, let's say 100 entities, but then the entity administering that fund says, or you have a set of guidelines that says you only become eligible out of that group of 100 entities once the decision maker administering the fund has decided to give you money, and that until such time you're not technically eligible, and therefore you don't get any notice of the potential of this fund. How does that fit?
Mr. Shoebridge, the way you describe it does, on face value, seem to be a bit odd, if that was how it worked. I'm thinking, though, as you speak, that there may be some occasions where a particular program has very explicit targeting to achieve a particular outcome. In that case, there may be an assessment by an agency of, what would be, what organisations, etc., would be eligible given the particular targeting of a program. Again, though, I don't think we've audited anything that we could, rely on to back that up. But that may be an occasion where you may, in fact, be very targeted in your allocation as opposed to just a general open up to anyone to apply.
If that was the case, you'd expect to find some kind of detailed preliminary analysis that
Absolutely.
This is how it is targeted, this is why it's happening, and some kind of documentary record to that effect. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we've found through our audits is, the need for absolute clarity of the objectives of the program and how it will proceed is what we would always be looking for.
Well, ask you if you've come across grants where one agency approves the funding, but another agency assesses the projects.
So regional assistance grants, approving the funding and assessing the projects. So in that case, there's a process whereby INSW, actually the regional water infrastructure grant is probably a better example of that. So the Department of Primary Industries, Department of DPI, thank you, made recommendations to INSW about water infrastructure grants that should be approved. So that's an example of one agency making recommendations about grants that could be approved, and another agency making further recommendations to the Treasurer about what should be funded out of that.
In which case you'd probably find two sets of sort of authorisation and documentation. I assume one in the initial agency that assesses the merits of the project and gives a recommendation based upon merits, and that would be documented. And then another assessment in the funding agency that says, well, this has come with this recommendation and we're going to fund it because it meets certain criteria. You normally expect to see two parallel or two-stage assessment process, and at some point a merit assessment.
What we would be looking to see is an agreement between the parties as to what is intended to happen, what the role of the assessing agency is, what the role of the recommending or approving agency is. So we would be looking for, again, clarity over what criteria would apply at each stage.
All right. And then some documentation expressly going through the criteria and the merit assessment with a considered sign-off. Is that a sort of non-negotiable part of the documentation?
When you say non-negotiable, I have to pause because it will depend on how the program has been established and the criteria that is applied, etc. But normally you would be looking at clear documentation of decision making. Yeah.
Thank you.
Look, I just want to, I'm not revisiting something that occurred this morning, but I just want to go to, in part, the submission that ICAC made with regards to another inquiry that I think, some of us are on so many inquiries we don't know what we're doing, but made a submission, I think, to this committee with regard to the funding of various bodies, including your own. But this is what ICAC said in Chapter 1, I think, where it identified, no, it's a special report of ICAC, the need for a new funding model for ICAC. Now, again, this is not what this morning was about, so I just want everyone to relax. But what the Commission started off by saying is, the Commission is presently funded through a mix of appropriations approved by the Parliament and grants from the Department of Premier and Cabinet. Now, the only reason I use those words, and irrespective of what we think about the current model of funding for ICAC or indeed the Auditor-General's office, I take it that when the Commission uses the term grants from the Department of Premier and Cabinet, that's actually not a term of art, that's a term of science. It is, in a sense, they're receiving a grant approved by the department. Is that right?
Okay, hopefully Scott's going to help me on this. It's a grant in a different meaning than I think what you're looking at in this inquiry, between a principal department in a cluster arrangement that really passes through funding appropriated in the form of, and it's called a grant. But it's, I think, quite a different concept than what you're looking at.
Indeed,
Scott,
I think
yeah.
I think I would absolutely agree with that proposition, but I suppose I'm going to what must be the most extremist, in a sense, of use of the term grant. But I'm putting to you that, in fact, through government, unlike perhaps as questions that have been posed by various members of this committee to various witnesses, the nature of the term and the nature of funding arrangements cover a huge spectrum that's reflective of circumstances that apply at the time.
Perhaps my answer, prior to coming here today, I did just take some time to look at the Commonwealth guidance around grants administration, and I found that quite helpful in that it distinguished very clearly between grants programs to external bodies and grants that may apply between government agencies, so that distinction is made very explicitly, so that sort of helps me. But Scott, in the financial audit, we're looking at grants between cluster agencies. Is there anything you would like to add about how that's defined or the general usage of that term?
I think you explained it well, but it's probably more of a history thing in that it's all about the appropriation to the cluster principal department, and it's really a pass-through, as the Auditor-General said. It's in that nature, and it's probably more of an accounting term that's been framed from an accounting standard point of view as a grant in that context, as rather than appropriation, and that's sort of more how it plays out in the financial statements.
Now I can really confuse you by calling it deemed appropriation.
Yeah.
Have you finished that point?
Sorry, Chair.
Yeah, no? Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Yep.
It's always been my understanding the focus of this inquiry is those external grants. There's a pool of public money available, and then how that then is allocated to external entities pursuant to some kind of rationale. They're the grants that this inquiry has been focusing on.
Sure, I'm not disagreeing with that proposition, David, at all.
I might just ask some questions about those grant schemes to those external agencies and about a couple of the essential elements of those. The first of those, I think you'd agree, that's just essential, is every grant scheme distributing money to those external agencies should have a decision maker. There should be someone who is making a decision, however that's constituted. That's quite a fundamental principle, isn't it?
Yes.
And secondly, there would usually be, it'd be very unusual for there not to be a recommendation. So might happen, or there'd almost certainly have to be in government there'd usually be a recommendation, this is what you might choose to do, and then the decision maker chooses to do that or to vary it or not do it at all. That's usually a reasonably fundamental part of the grant scheme.
If we're talking in broad terms, that's correct. I would just sort of highlight a difference from that approach, though, which is grants to non-government schools, which is another performance audit that we've conducted. And the way that schools become eligible for that grants is under the Education Act. They are eligible as a non-government school under that legislation, and then the department has a funding formula that it applies.
So that's a good example of it. So either a recommendation or maybe a formula would be another way.
A set funding formula, exactly.
Yeah, but something that's clear, transparent.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there's not necessarily a recommendation from a funding formula, because the funding formula is the recommendation in a way.
Yeah.
But indeed, if you look at the schools grants to non-government schools, starting to transgress onto somewhat tender ground, actually there's not transparency, for instance, with regards to the monies that are provided to the Catholic school system, is there? Indeed, it's a bit of a mystery as to how the money that's handed over is then distributed between the various schools.
Well, that's a subsequent distribution. The transfer from government to the system is quite...
Well, that part of it's transparent, but the actual end part is not.
Ms. Khan, it is correct what you say, and that's what we found in our performance audit report, that once it enters the Catholic school system, it is distributed by the Catholic school system, and that was not transparent to us during the conduct of that audit.
And just to be clear, I'm not asking about the activities of numerous agencies, numerous organisations outside of government. I do want to ask, though, this question about grant schemes by government, and that is the other fundamental principle is there must be a decision. There's a point of decision, and that should be documented in some way. That's just fundamental to the operation.
Yeah, I mean, as a principle.
Yeah, certainly as a principle, without, there may be some exceptions, but certainly we haven't come across any that I'm aware of.
One of the concerns that this committee's dealt with and the Parliament's dealing with is, in relation to stronger communities, the suggestion that there is a decision maker, there has been a decision, but there's no signed written brief recording that decision. I don't want you to necessarily comment on the specific nature of that, because I think that would be unfair to you without having examined it in much closer detail, although something I might encourage you to do at some future, nearby future occasion. But the idea that there's a point of... that was another matter.
Oh, right.
The idea that there's a point of decision, but that thinking about the fact that it might not have been recorded, there might not be in government a signed written brief recording that decision, that would certainly be of concern to you, wouldn't it?
Yep, absolutely. And in fact, nearly all of our audits of grants programs have made reference to absence of documentation, especially documentation being very specific as to the reason for the decision, or especially if a recommendation is overturned. So we've called that out in, I think, all of these audits that we've referenced. We found examples where documentation has been lacking and have made a point to call that out.
This committee might want to have regard to the State Records Act as well in its consideration, because where we have called out lack of transparency over recording key decisions, we broadly make reference to that legislation and the obligations that it provides.
Yep, no, understood. And you've referred there to the reasons, so it'd be good if the reasons were recorded, but I'm winding back to something even more fundamental, which is recording the signature and date of the decision maker. It'd be very unusual to not record that, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. In relation to the point you made about the state records agencies, if there's those records agencies and the State Records Act require the retention of certain information, thinking about the sort of information that should be retained around that decision, if there's information that's material to the actual decision, that's influencing the decision, that would be the sort of material you'd want to see kept under those provisions, wouldn't it?
That is certainly the sort of material that we would look to see in the conduct of a performance audit.
Yeah, so if it was material
that's not quite the question that you're asking, though, is it?
No, so I'm asking if material, I'm thinking in this case something in the electronic space, if something's material to weighing up an assessment about which projects are funded and which are not, it's material to the decision-making process, it's recorded at the time, that's the sort of material that would start to attract obligations under the State Records Act, requiring to be retained so that you could do your job. Is that correct?
Broadly, that's correct. Yep.
Broadly, I guess
that
goes...
assumes that the record exists, doesn't it? You can criticise a grant scheme for not having proper documentation, but you can't then ping them under the State Records Act if they don't have the proper
And just to reassure the member, I'm heading somewhere entirely different.
Right, all right, as long as you are.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm going to put my foot in it then, but I was going to reference again the proportionate nature of programs. So again, it depends. You know, if it's a small amount of money to be distributed very broadly, you may have one piece of evidence that, you know, collectively assesses, for example. So it's proportionate, I think, to the amount of money, the purpose of the program, eligibility, etc.
But for example, if there was a criteria being applied to the decision that influenced what the decision was, and there was that record of being created, you'd expect it to be retained. So you could do your job.
Yes. If the record has been created, we would expect it to be retained.
And you'd be concerned if it was destroyed?
We would call that out as a potential finding in an audit, yes.
And finally...
It would be unlawful, wouldn't it? It would be unlawful if the record was destroyed. It would be unlawful.
We'd have to take that on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
It wouldn't, for instance, be unlawful, and this is not necessarily any of the criteria, if the record was lost or destroyed through inadvertence or otherwise. It might be, from an audit point of view, inappropriate, but there's a difference between the inadvertent loss of perhaps the wrong word, inadvertent loss of a document and the deliberate destruction of a document to hide a chain of decision-making. That'd be right, wouldn't it?
I don't think we'd be going... we would be calling out what happened. We would be looking for the evidence and describing in our audit as a finding what occurred, and probably not going beyond that.
Right.
And finally...
You can't guess now about falling in front of a tractor or placed in front of a tractor.
I wasn't going to go there, David, but only because I'm in the chair.
I saw a tractor once.
I'll offer you the chance to respond to that, but I think I can see you declining. I might just finally ask this. One of the concerns about the Stronger Communities Fund, and again, I don't really expect you to comment on the specifics of the fund,
although you keep referring to it,
but it's a very broad criteria. So for the tied funding grants round, essentially the criteria is as simple as the New South Wales Government will make these decisions according to New South Wales Government priorities. That's about the guidance that's provided. So as a result, nearly anything fits in that scope of works. To me, that seems very, very broad. In fact, so broad it makes it impossible to then go back and audit any. There's no sense of concrete purpose for this guide. Anything could happen. It then makes it very difficult for you to do your job again. Have you got any observations that you would like to make about how broad that statement is, or how broad things should be in general?
I think you're correct in saying that that would be, if that was the nature of the guidance, that would make it very difficult to audit compliance against that guidance. Having said that, I'm interested in one of our earlier audits, again before my time, but the one on industry assistance. I think that audit then stepped back further and to what it was intended, what was the policy frame and the intention, and really said, were the arrangements appropriate to deliver on government's intent with that program, and made some commentary, I believe, that was critical of adding clarity to how was that intent actually delivered at the time and over time. So you know, the audit would approach that slightly differently than just saying, you know, you've either complied or didn't comply with your own guidelines.
So I might head to Ms. Husos.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to ask you, Ms. Crawford, so we have received in our previous hearing some testimony about the most significant amount of money that was transferred in this second tied grant round, which is the one that we're most concerned about. And I'm not going to put the specifics to you because, again, I don't think that that's fair, and obviously I don't want to prejudice any future investigations. But I do want to ask you some general questions around the allocation of funding, and if funding is coming either from a grants program that's been clearly approved in the way that it should, or whether it's coming from the Treasury, from the consolidated fund or from the managed fund. Can you just talk through what would be the appropriate approvals if it wasn't coming from the money that had been dispersed to the grants fund, but if instead it was coming from Treasury? Would that require sign-off from the Treasurer?
I'm not sure I could comment really without knowing, you know, real life circumstances. I don't know that I can make a general response to that unless Scott, no. Claudia?
No, I mean, there are, as we've talked about, there are specific sort of legislative requirements for funds like Restart New South Wales. I think there are a different set of arrangements around things that come out of consolidated funding, but we'd happily take that on notice and provide what information we can.
I might reframe it and put it on notice for you. I mean, the question that I'm really asking is, if it's coming from the consolidated fund, then there's a different approval process than if it's coming from a grants fund. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I just also wanted to ask you about the follow the money provisions, which again came from the ICAC submission, and talked about the need for more transparency for government funding once it actually does go from the government to the private sector or to the not-for-profit sector, or more broadly is dispersed. Would you be able to provide us with some comments around what you think that would be, or how that could actually work in practice?
So it's a mandate, a matter for the mandate that has been pursued for many years here in New South Wales. We are at odds with other audit officers around Australia and New Zealand in not having that mandate. In practical terms, though, it would really simply apply to a performance audit, not to financial audit, to a performance audit, and it would be a matter of, again, identifying what was intended through the program and then being able to look to see whether, in fact, that was actually delivered. So we're trying, that's how we see that mandate. So it's just to follow what was the government intending in the granting of funds to a non-government agency. Did that non-government agency actually deliver on what was required?
And you mentioned that New South Wales is one of the few jurisdictions that doesn't have these provisions.
I think it's almost the only one now. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, sure. Sorry, I just wanted to make one final thing, which was the ICAC again referred to the National Audit Office and significant number of audits they have done. There's no formal way for them to be implemented in New South Wales legislation if it's not done through a policy of, say, DPC or through a government body, is it? Like, there's no interaction between you and the National Audit Office?
There's I can assure
sorry, I should say
there's a lot of interaction, but we don't do joint audits.
Yes.
No, because of we both operate under our own legislation, so we don't operate jointly, but we certainly do speak a lot.
To be clear, no, that, yeah.
So I might turn to Mr. Shoebridge.
That should disturb all decision makers if there's secret Auditor-General gatherings in the country.
Yeah,
it's probably a good thing. Could I ask about in terms of documentation? Have you noticed any instances where there has been a parallel chain of communication, an informal, non-accessible chain of communication that has led to decision making? And here I'm thinking in particular of the sort of spate of communications that we see on encrypted devices, such as encrypted platforms such as Signal, or maybe WhatsApp, or maybe by text message. Have you come across that at all in any of your auditing of any grants?
No, is the short answer to that question. I think just to explain the performance audit process a little bit, what usually happens is that we commence with an information request to agencies, and we ask them to provide us with all information that's relevant to the topic that we're auditing. Something like an encrypted, communication via a messaging app has never been sort of furnished, as far as I'm aware, through that information request process. We can conduct certain sort of investigative approaches in our analysis of information, but I'm not aware that we've ever applied that in a grants administration process where it would flush out a parallel communication process like the one that you've just described. So the agents... Yeah, sorry.
No, I didn't mean to cut you off. Finish.
So the agency, the information that is provided to us is collated and given to us by the agency itself. And then if there are gaps in that, obvious gaps in decision making or documentation of decision making, for example, we would seek to further understand why those gaps exist.
So you've never been provided with an exchange of text messages, for example, in any of these grants audits?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Does it strike you as, well, has it ever raised concerns within the audit office that none of these style of records, these more ephemeral communications, have ever been produced? I'm just thinking now that becoming increasingly prevalent in our communications. Has it ever been raised in the audit office about catching these more ephemeral forms of communication?
The way we capture those more ephemeral things is in interviewing a range of stakeholders. And so we interview staff at all levels of an organisation, and we conduct those interviews in confidence. And so we have an expectation that staff as public servants will be honest with us about their communications as part of that interview process. So that's the main way that we, reassure ourselves that there's not something going on outside of the documentation that we're not necessarily seeing.
I've got to say, from my, experience of decision making and human nature, it seems to me that it would be hard to credit that at no point in any of these grants programs has there been no communication relevant, communication about decision making via at least text message. Do you think I'm being, too suspicious about human activity?
I think where gaps in documentation have existed in the grants programs that we've examined, we've certainly called those gaps out where decisions haven't been recorded or there's insufficient information to demonstrate why a particular organisation has received a grant. So we've certainly covered that issue in detail in a number of our performance audit reports. I agree with you that we haven't necessarily gone to the cause of that, whether there's some sort of parallel communication method, but yeah, we have made comment on that.
A telephone call or a chat over a coffee is a parallel form of communication, isn't it? It's just not an adequate method well, it's not a method of recording the approval of a grant or the suggestion of the approval of a grant. It doesn't really matter if it's a conversation or a WhatsApp chat. It's just not what you do. That's essentially the position.
Look, it's a sort of an aside, but I know that, like, even myself, sometimes when we get to the end of an audit, not so much a grant audit, but just audits in general, there's often communication, for example, between myself and the secretary of an organisation to close down any perhaps unintended confusion about our findings and the like. I personally, if I'm using text messaging, I take a photo of that text message and put it on our files. So, I'm very conscious that whatever medium you use, you keep the record. But we wouldn't necessarily go to every organisation and say, hand over your mobile phones. And in fact, I doubt that we could do that.
But do you think it might be at a minimum prudent to express overtly in any funding guidelines that decision making needs to be recorded, it needs to happen through formalised channels, and if there is any relevant communication on whatever channel, that needs to actually be recorded to expressly state that? And then I don't know how you would go about checking the compliance with that in an audit process. I'm sorry I've asked two questions in one, but is it just too hard?
Well, I mean, I guess your question doesn't just relate to funding guidelines. I think it's, the obligation of public servants to record their activities. That's expressed in the State Records Act. It doesn't mean you have to, jot down the minutiae of your day, but obviously things that influence outcomes, particularly outcomes for the community, things that influence the transfer of money, they are the things that public servants are required to make records of and are required to make those records accessible to us in the conduct of our work.
All right. Well, my last question is this: Have you ever come across ministers who have a separate email account where relevant information regarding a grant or a decision in relation to a grant has come through an email account separate to what is publicly provided or used in their day-to-day work as a minister?
We haven't audited ministerial email accounts as far as I'm aware. I could point you to one example where we've commented that a decision made in a minister's office was not transparent, and that was in relation to the Transport Access Program. That wasn't about a grant in particular, but it was about funding to improve train station access, and a recommendation about projects went into the minister's office, and a different outcome came out, and we weren't able to oversight the reason for that. That's probably an example of the sort of thing that you're trying to draw out here, Mr. Shoebridge, but we haven't looked at whether that was managed through parallel email accounts or the suggestion that they might exist in that case.
Is that because your auditing power doesn't extend into ministers' offices, or is it just where there's a sort of protocol to draw the line for documentation?
I think with some of these things you're talking about, it's up to the agency to have appropriate systems in place to record the transactions and to evidence those transactions. And as auditors, we're looking for appropriate audit evidence, no matter what form it comes in, and we'll assess that evidence as presented by the agency. So I guess we would look at the evidence that's given by the agency for whatever we're looking at.
But if it's made in the ministerial office, it's not an agency decision. So that's why I go back to that question. Do your audit powers extend where decisions making is made within a ministerial office?
but we may not have to go that far to actually get the evidence we require.
Got Mr. Mason.
So, for example, Mr. Shoebridge, we don't have automatic access to Cabinet, for example. So when we're looking, because many decisions, of course, are made through Cabinet processes, we ask for access via DPC, and as a matter of convention, we're provided with that access, but we don't. Our legislation does not provide for that automatically.
So it's more about the nature of the information rather than the person who holds it.
Right, we might turn to Mr. Mason-Cox.
Just a simple question, and I might have overlooked this in some of the material, but is there a best practice guide about how to establish a grants program and what the fundamental elements should be for government agencies?
So I think reference has already been made that here in New South Wales there is guidance provided by DPC. That guidance was last updated in 2010, and that still is the substantive piece of guidance for New South Wales public servants. We've looked more broadly for other guidance, and there's many examples. Perhaps the one that I referenced earlier from by the Commonwealth Government is really quite a comprehensive and practical guide that may be worth looking at.
So the 2010 Premier's guidelines, in your view, does that need to be updated?
In fact, I understand that it was last updated as a result of a performance audit by the then Auditor-General. I've looked at it and I consider that it covers off, at a principles level, it's still quite useful. It just perhaps doesn't go as far, for example, as the Commonwealth guidance, which is more, not without being overwhelming, it's just more detailed and is very, very clear on, roles and responsibilities of ministers and departments, etc., whereas the DPC guidance doesn't go quite to that extent. In 10 years, there's probably many things that have happened that would benefit some sort of update of that guidance.
And just turning back to the State Records Act, since you have raised this a couple of times, I just want to confirm that the State Records Act applies to ministerial officers.
It does.
Yeah. And in fact, there's a higher threshold for the Premier's office over other ministerial officers when one looks to the things that might be required for the state archives.
That's not come to our attention in the conduct of an audit, so...
Yeah, no worries. I might just put it to you and ask you to take it on notice. But, yeah, it appears that briefing notes or papers maintained in the Premier's office are required to be retained in the state archives, whereas briefing notes or papers of other ministers are really required to be retained in the state archives if they're of broader significance. So separate to obviously having to keep them for administrative or audit purposes, which applies strictly to both.
So what would you like for us to do?
I'm just interested if you've got any views about that on notice, either the limitations or the limitations of that application or how broad it is on notice. I'd be interested to.
So we may, yes, take that on notice, look at the requirements and reflect as to how they may or may not have impacted either past work that we've done or possible future work.
Thank you. Right, I'll just check if there's any other committee questions. Otherwise, I think we're coming to a close almost right on time. Thank you for your attendance today. It's been very helpful, and for your submission, just setting out some of the general principles that I think will really inform the work of this committee and its report.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For the questions you have taken on notice, we've resolved that they be returned within 14 days and the Secretariat will be in contact. Thank you.